Okay, let's get started with Chapter 7, Artificiality in Research. One of the big complaints about research is that it's not real life. And so as soon as consumers of the research hear things like the study was conducted on mice, or the subjects in the study were college students, or this was a laboratory experiment under controlled conditions, they start to think to themselves, that's so fake. That's not right. I mean, humans aren't mice. Not all humans are college students. Um, yeah, maybe they behaved like that in a laboratory, but is that normal behavior for humans? Those are all questions about the artificiality of research and how it may not be, reliable. So what I wanted to do to sort of set up the big debate is to make a comparison between the type of research that participants are probably the most familiar with, or that observers are probably the most familiar with, and that's polls. That's the kind of, I'll say, quote unquote research that most people are the most familiar with. I want to compare polls to scientific studies. Polls are vastly different from what we do in research. Even when in psychology we use surveys to do our research, our surveys are completely different from the procedure used in polling. For one thing, pollsters randomly select their respondents. So what does that mean? That means that from all the people in the group who could potentially participate, the pollsters randomly select a subset. I'm launching into a web page of, the last time I updated these slides was 2010, don't judge me. So I happen to have a 2010 election example that I wanted to show you. And it's right here. Washington survey of 750 likely voters on October 26th, 2010. So enmeshed in that phrase is a couple of pieces of information about the sampling that the pollsters used. One is they used 750 participants. It's a pretty big number, actually, surprisingly large number. There are about 8 million people in the state of Washington. Of that 8 million people, probably half of them are under the age of 18, and that's being pretty conservative in my estimate. Of those that are over 18, probably 3/4 of them are registered to vote. So we're looking at maybe 3 million people in the state of Washington who are actually registered to vote. So 750 is plenty of people to represent the 3 million people who are registered to vote in the state of Washington. There's something else in that phrase. They've got the phrase likely voters. That means that these are people who voted in the previous election, in the previous non-presidential election. They usually don't use presidential election years because, it seems like people get pretty excited in presidential years and people will come out and vote. Non-presidential years, now that's interesting. If you voted in that, you're probably a voter. Okay, so 750 likely voters were selected. And what selected means in a poll is their numbers were drawn by the random dialer and they were called. So 750, and they kept randomly dialing until they got the 750 that they needed. Okay, so now if we look at the results of this October 26th, 2010 poll, it's the election for Washington Senate, and you'll notice that Dino Rossi is ahead of Patty Murray. Now if you know anything about politics at all, you know that Patty Murray is still our senator. So you know that obviously this poll did not predict the actual voting behavior of the 750. Well, it might have predicted these 750 people, but it didn't accurately predict the 3 million potential voters that exist in the state of Washington. And that's the issue with polls. A lot of times the sample being randomly selected with certain kinds of limitations. Yes, I randomly selected numbers to call, but there were some biases inherent in who responded to my phone call. And so that means that those 750 people that I polled were not necessarily a great representation of all the voters in the state. So in polls, the pollsters randomly select their respondents, whereas in studies, we don't randomly select from the population. People volunteer to contribute to our studies. So there's a certain benefit to that, because that means that we have a little bit of control over who we recruit and who ends up participating, and we can try and ensure that we have people who represent the population that we're trying to generalize to. Whereas in polling, they randomly select, and so they may end up with people who are skewed one way or the other and are not necessarily representative of the population. Having people volunteer can be a downside for studies, though, because sometimes we have people who like to participate in studies and they keep volunteering for every study that they're offered. We have medical research. One of the big criticisms right now is that in medical research we have basically professional participants who keep signing up for drug trials, and that they may have cumulative effects across the different drug trials that they've been participating in, and they no longer represent the average person who might take this medication. So there are some pros to the fact that our participants volunteer, but there are also some negatives associated with the fact that our participants volunteer. Another issue in polling is that the people who design the poll may not be really cognizant, really aware of proper question writing. And they may even have a direct bias. And so they may generate questions that are leading and cause people to answer the question the way that the pollster wants. Here's another example from that same Rasmussen website. This one's from 10 days earlier than the last one. It's October 17th, 2010. Again, about the Washington Senate. Here's an interesting issue in number 1. In the 2010 election for the United States Senate, did you vote for Dino Rossi or Patty Murray? Well, the election happened in November, so obviously it should have been phrased in the future tense. But will you, or I guess we have mail-in ballots, will you or did you vote for Dino Rossi or Patty Murray? Now note here, it says, please note that we split the survey to rotate the order of the candidate names so that half would hear the Republican candidate first and the other half would hear the Democrat mentioned first. So they were careful enough to realize that there might be order effects, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But so that's something good. Okay, let's scroll down to something that's a little bit less good. Number 4, tax cuts implemented during the Bush administration are scheduled to expire soon. Should the Bush administration tax cuts be extended, or should the tax cuts end this year? Okay, I don't know if you guys are picking up on what I might be putting down here with regard to leading, but there are certain kinds of phrases and terms and words that can be hot button issues for respondents. For people who are answering political polls, Bush administration can be one of those hot button issues that makes a person answer in a way that may not represent their general attitude about the topic. They may react positively or negatively to the hot button component of the question. So sometimes leading questions don't look all that leading. You have to, like, if you did not know what these words meant, if you dropped down from Mars and you basically could speak the English language but you knew nothing about context, you might think, well, this looks like a perfectly fine question. But the fact that it has Bush administration in it, to flip that, see how it says a proposal has been made to repeal the health care bill? In more recent polling, they've started calling it Obamacare. And that has that same hot button issue where either it makes people very loyal to it or it makes people very anti that topic. And so the person might be responding to the term and not to their general attitude about the concept. The other thing that I wanted to point out, where did it go? They used a subtle form of leading by asking, do you consider yourself part of the Tea Party movement? Now, a person who maybe wasn't really part of that movement but might have had sympathies with it, hearing that phrase can activate in their mind awareness of a whole bunch of other things that go along with that. And then that could affect their answer to this question about the rating the job that Barack Obama has been doing as president. So you can prime a person to end up giving a more favorable or unfavorable rating on number 12 by using Tea Party movement in number 11. So it's very subtle. It's not necessarily something that a person could objectively look at the question and say, well, obviously it's bad. It can be very subtle. And so the poll generator might say, well, I wasn't trying to lead people, but the effect is that they're leading people in their responses. I was trying to use this timer up here, but I notice every time I leave, it stops the timer. So I'm getting the impression this is not an accurate timer. This is what's called research. I was testing my hypothesis that I could time myself here. Yeah, that's not going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and take a break here just because I think I've been talking for 10 minutes, and then we will come back to this, the wording effects and my examples in the next segment.